This morning, early voting kicked off this weekend for the Coastal Bend mayoral and council member runoffs.
3 News reporter Ashley Gonzalez shows us why community participation in these types of runoffs is just as important as the presidential election, if not more.
Early voting for the Corpus Christi runoff election has already begun. While Coastal Bend voters just went down this road election day, political analysts are saying voter turnout this time around carries a little more weight. Corpus Christi is no stranger to a runoff. In fact, there was one last presidential election in 2016. Political science professor Dr. Travis Braidwood says runoffs are pretty common, and not just here in the Coastal Bend.
To ensure that the will of the voters is carried forward. And this often comes up in races where you have multiple candidates running for the same office, where it's harder to get a solid majority.
Braidwood says local runoffs do not get nearly as much attention as presidential elections. But even then, voter turnout is still very important, if not more important, because runoff results directly affect the community.
Speeding ticket or improvements to public works or local education, these things are handled at the local level, right? It's not the federal government handing these things down. And so really these races are fundamentally important because they're going to shape with how we, daily on our daily lives actually see, our interactions and our place in society.
Historically, Texas voters have never really questioned the integrity of how their votes are being handled by election officials.
If you look nationally at the criticisms that the Trump administration has levied against particular states, you'll notice that Texas is not one of those, and that's largely because Texas has pretty strict limitations on how people actually conduct their votes and conduct voting.
Braidwood added, on top of the integrity that the election holds, voters can also count on their health being put first and looked after during this pandemic.
Spreading out machines, constantly sanitizing the machines after they're used, offering things like hand sanitizers, mandating mask wearing. So if you're thinking about being an average voter and you're going into one of these locations, it seems that overall your risk is going to be minimal in terms of exposure.
Early voting continues this week until Friday. Election day is next Tuesday, December 15th. Reporting, Ashley Gonzalez, 3 News.